Michael, you said that this concept, this idea that we're going to see a massive, irrevocable shift to work from home is overblown. Why do you say that? And what are the people getting wrong who do say that this is just irreversible, it's going to be huge?
My thinking is based largely on years of experience in serving knowledge workers. And what I've observed in the last decade and a half is that almost all of the decisions with respect to the utilization of workspace are based on what knowledge workers want from their work environment. They want open space where they can interact creatively and collaboratively. They want high quality air delivery so they don't fall asleep at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They want natural light. And almost most importantly, they want to be situated in amenity-rich urban environments where they can do all kinds of other things in close proximity to their workplace that is important to them in their lives. So my feeling is knowledge workers rule, and the owners or the senior executives do what they want because they're so important to the ongoing growth and prosperity of the business. I don't believe that has changed. The owners or executives may like the idea of reducing occupancy cost on the profit and loss statement, and who wouldn't like that idea? But it's really a question of what that very valuable resource wants, the men and women who are actually driving the business on a daily basis. And my belief is what they want has not changed. And my belief also is that they rule. Now, if either of those beliefs is wrong, then I may be wrong. And indeed, we may see a bigger number of men and women working from home. But I would be very surprised. And certainly lastly, not to over answer the question, but I would be very surprised to see that happen in Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, or Vancouver because of the experience we've had during the downturn, where people have been determined to renew their space, where people have not pushed back on rental rates, and where people have not pushed back on lease term. So there's been no evidence during the worst of the downturn that people actually are going to reduce their commitment to their space. In fact, they're frantically striving to ensure they have it over the longer term because there's a shortage of it right now. So these are the reasons, if you will, combined, that I think the working from home, WFH movement is overstated quite considerably. And we are seeing organizations in the world who have made rather grand proclamations about working from home, committing to significant amounts of additional space.
Yeah, that brings us to Shopify, the lead tenant at The Well, which you're developing in downtown Toronto with RioCan. They've committed to taking up more than 430,000 square feet. We also understand they've exercised their option to take even more space at The Well. But on the other hand, they're also saying we will have a large chunk of our workers working from home. So can you confirm that Shopify will take more space at The Well?
Well, Shopify is committed to space at The Well. The commitment initially was for around 250,000 square feet, I believe, a very nice part of the tower that is now well underway. They have committed to an additional 90,000 square feet recently, bringing their total commitment to 340,000 square feet. We have a very good relationship with Shopify. We have served Shopify in other buildings in the urban Toronto market, most notably King Portland Centre. So while I can't speak for Shopify and wouldn't presume to, urban workspace is part of how they operate, and I expect will be part of how they operate into the future. the balance between working from home and working from urban workspace is, of course, not something I'm able to comment on with any insight.
Michael, let's look more broadly at this recent crash. You've said it's more like 08, 09, but let's go back to the late 80s, early 90s, which you have said were just brutal, and you learned a lot from that. So what did you learn from that crash that you can apply to this current situation?
You're absolutely right. The crash in, let's call it early 1990, lasted for 5 years at least, if not longer. And it represented two things. One, the complete collapse of the office market in downtown Toronto. And number two, the veritable collapse of the entire industry. So we saw an entire industry collapse over that period of time, primarily because it was over-indebted. It had way too much debt, and it had the wrong kind of debt. So while things were going wonderfully in the 80s, that debt afforded great leverage, and the variable rate debt kept interest costs as low as they could be. It worked beautifully until things went badly. Then the providers of the variable rate debt said, we want our money back now, and nobody could afford to pay it back. And literally the industry collapsed. It reconstituted itself during that 5-year period and the subsequent 5-year period. But in terms of lessons applicable today, lesson number one, and maybe the most important, is the real estate industry is no longer over-levered. In fact, it is very conservatively levered. All major players have very modest amounts of debt in relation to their asset base, have very modest amounts of debt in relation to their EBITDA or their net operating income, whichever measure you want to use, and they can withstand not only a sudden and severe crisis, but a protracted crisis. It won't be painless, but they won't collapse as they cope with the pressure on revenue streams. That's the biggest lesson from the early 90s. So we learned it. And the fact that we learned it is what I think bodes well for the real estate industry today. The nature of this downturn feels more like the global financial crisis. It was sudden, it was severe, but there was a fairly rapid recovery even in the equity markets, but also in the underlying values. The other lesson from the early 90s is how to deal with tenants, users, who don't want to pay rent. And when, as a result of a shutdown caused by a global pandemic, your revenue goes to zero, you don't want to pay rent. Now, we're not a bank, we're not a charity, but we do need to know, and we do need to discern who needs our help under the circumstances and who is being opportunistic. And of course, we learned that in the early 90s very well. So it wasn't hard for Allied in this instance to know who we should support, because owner, occupier, owner, user, it's a relationship, it's not a transaction. It's a relationship that endures over time, and who we shouldn't support. And I think we've done a very good job in that respect.
We're in this lower interest rate for what seems like forever environment. So how is that impacting Allied in terms of, yes, debt is cheap. How does that affect you on the other side in terms of being able to renew at rates that are appealing to you and attractive?
Certainly, our ability to refinance is improved. The first market to recover in this particular crisis was the bond market, and we took advantage of that. The bond market reopened very quickly, and as a BBB mid issuer, we were able to access it on very favorable terms. We did an 8-year transaction at 3.13%, which I consider to be excellent, and very, very supportive of the business. So the debt environment is very, very stable, very reliable, and I think it's because the real estate industry is so conservatively financed. So for us, debt renewal, debt rollover is an opportunity, not a risk. It's an opportunity to actually reduce our interest costs going forward.
You made something like $550 million worth of acquisitions 2019. This year it's around 570, the most recent Victoria Square in Montreal, The Landing, very cool old building in Vancouver. I'm just wondering, as you've been running this company all these years, what balance do you try to strike between organic growth, development, and these kinds of acquisitions?
Well, it's a great question, and it's, in a way, one of the most interesting parts of running the business. Because the two components of external growth are acquisitions on one hand and development on the other. Acquisitions aren't entirely within our control in the sense that what fits within our investment and operating focus may or may not present itself as an opportunity in a given year. And there are no macro factors that govern that. It's more individual decisions, which in the case of The Landing in Vancouver brought that opportunity forward that we could take advantage of. So we never know at the beginning of the year that we can do $350 million in acquisitions. And we are driven more by whether the opportunity fits our focus and will make us ultimately a better operator and better able to serve our tenants. The development side of the business is very interesting in the sense that we do have more control over that. It's a riskier component of the business. So what we've done is we've imposed on ourselves a limitation. And the limitation is this: the total cost of our developments at any given point in time can't exceed 15% of our book value. And it's a binary limitation. There's no close. We have to be less than 15%. And what we're doing there is ensuring that we don't allocate too much capital to the riskier component of our activity at the expense or to the detriment of the more stable, the more predictable component of our activity. And of course, from development, we can generate higher returns and create more value. And so that's how the number one governing factor for those two elements is really the limitation on development. And so the more we grow, the more we can develop in absolute terms, but that relative limitation stays in place, and we believe in it. We believe it's the right balance for a public real estate entity.
Speaking of 15%, your urban data center, UDC, makes up about 15% of the business. Where would you like to see that percentage get to in time over the next several years? You've described the UDC as one of the 8 big telecom hubs in North America.
Yes, we for a long time felt that we would plateau at 15%, and then by virtue of the growth in the remainder of the business, the percentage allocation from UDC would decline. Not that the revenue from that asset base would decline, but relative to the rest of the asset base, it would decline. What we now feel, because of our ability to drive revenue from the existing assets and the possibility, and I want to emphasize possibility, not necessarily yet probability, of acquiring additional like assets, I now have a longer term goal for the business to see UDC at 20%. Okay. So that means it will have to grow either internally or externally more than the rest of the business in the next 5 years. I don't think that's an inevitability, but that is an aspiration, a goal, and I think it's probably achievable, especially given the extraordinary importance these assets have in our telecommunications system in Canada.
You've said as founder and CEO, you spend a good deal of your time doing strategic thinking and thinking about the vision of the company. You've got a couple of granddaughters, you've got a couple more grandkids on the way. So when they're in their early 20s coming into the workforce and maybe they work at an allied property, what's the vision? What's it going to look like?
I appreciate the question personally and professionally, because when my grandchildren were first born in the last 2 or 3 years, I started seeing the world through them, not through their eyes necessarily, but through their reality in our family and in my world. And I began to think more consciously about what we were doing in relation to the impact it would have on their generation and subsequent generations. And I deeply believe that thinking that way makes sustainability vital to every practitioner in our business. We need to make the necessary contribution to sustainability within our sector, because we can make a big contribution. The carbon footprint is impacted materially by what we do. The second thing is wellness. Buildings can literally enhance your well-being, or they can undermine it. And I think there was a time when workspace was actually inimical to human health, or at least posed threat to it. I believe the technology exists, and I know, and it's not my achievement, but thanks to brilliant engineers and scientists, the technology exists today to ensure that buildings actually contribute to human wellness and human health. And of course, the pandemic has made that even more important than it was, but the importance was evident before the pandemic. And I think because the industry is thinking, we know the notion of baby boomers and even millennials is completely passé. It's irrelevant. That's not the generation we're working for. It's whatever my grandchildren are and whatever the generations are that come beyond them. They're who we're working for. And I think a lot of people would agree with me in that regard, although they might not put my grandchildren in the group as fully as I do. But that's kind of how I look at it. And so I think the trends that were evident in our business, the importance of open planning, the importance of creative interaction, the importance of amenity-rich environments, the importance of sustainability, and the importance of wellness, those trends are simply reinforced now by what we're living through collectively.
So you went ahead there for us by about 20 years. Let's go back 30 years. You're 33. You are working at Aird and Burles. You're a partner there for nearly 5 years, but you always had this desire to be an entrepreneur, go out on your own. So where did that drive come from? What was that ambition? What was that spark to create what has become this multi-billion-dollar business?
Well, my father said to me when I was my father was an engineer, and he said to me when I was very young, and by very young I mean 16, 17, he said, you know, if I had it to do over again, I would go to law school. And I thought, well, why? My dad was a professional manager and had a successful career. I said, why? And he said, it seems to be such a versatile training. Lawyers seem to have been able to parlay that training into political careers, into government careers, into business, into journalism, into all different walks of life. And I would like to have had that flexible training. And I went to law school with exactly that in mind. I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but the more I thought about it, even while I was at law school, the more convinced I was that I wanted to be in business. I didn't know what that meant. It wasn't in my background. It was almost this seductive, alluring thought, and I didn't know what it meant, but I wanted it. And so as I started my career as a lawyer, I made it clear to Aird and Burles and others that, listen, if I can, I'm going to try to find my way into business, but while I'm here, I'll give you everything I've got. And Aird and Burles was perfectly happy with that trade, and in fact, I probably became much more valuable to Aird and Burles as a client than I was as a lawyer.
Right.
But I just had this almost immature, poorly understood notion that I wanted to be in business. I wanted to be a principal rather than an advisor. And I was fortunate at Aird & Burles to work for a number of real estate organizations. I was a corporate securities lawyer, but we did work for a number of real estate organizations, and through them, I got a little bit of insight into what the realities of real estate were. And I've always, I think, been observant of and acutely sensitive to the physical environment. So it just gave a little bit of dimension to what I wanted, and I was lucky enough in '88 to put together a very small group with some capital and to start in the business as nothing more than an inspired amateur. And really, I was lucky in two respects, not to go on too long, but the first 18 months of our business occurred during the tail end of the boom. So we got a feel for what success was like, because for 18 months we did really, really well. And then the market collapsed, and we spent the next 60 months striving to survive and actually learning how to run real estate in the most adverse circumstances possible. And that was a great education. So I had a vague aspiration, which became a little more informed through the practice of law, but ultimately only became fully informed when we went through total collapse, and we managed to survive.